The plane buzzed with impatient passengers. Overhead bins slamming shut, the air thick with recycled breath and quiet irritation. The single mother slid into her seat, her knees trembling as she tried to balance her newborn and keep her toddler from bouncing too hard against the seat. Her shirt clung to her with worry and exhaustion, and the crying baby only made her pulse beat faster. She whispered soft shushing sounds, her fingers shaking slightly as she tucked the swaddle tighter around the infant. People glanced their way, some with sympathy, others with the silent judgment she had grown far too used to. Her toddler, innocent to all of it, sat cross-legged on the seat, humming her own tune while swinging her legs. She opened her little cookie box with a triumphant gasp. The mother tried to smile, tried to breathe. Even though her throat felt tight from holding in tears she didn't have time to shed. A sudden jolt from someone brushing past startled her, and the cookie box tumbled from the toddler's lap. It clattered down the aisle, bouncing once, twice, before stopping at a polished shoe. A man stepped into view as he bent to pick it up. Not just any man, broad-shouldered, tailored suit sharp even under the airplane lights, his expression unreadable at first glance. But when he straightened and looked at them, something softened in his eyes. He handed the box back, careful, almost gentle, as if afraid to startle the toddler. "This is yours," he said, his voice low and steady, like someone who didn't raise it often but didn't need to. The toddler giggled, reaching out for the box, and the mother felt her cheeks heat in embarrassment. She murmured an apology, but the man shook his head with a faint smile, though his gaze shifted to her longer than expected, studying, noticing the strain in her eyes, the fatigue she couldn't hide. For a heartbeat she felt exposed, as if he could see the weight she carried. Then he stepped back into the flow of boarding passengers, but not before offering one last glance, something unreadable, something that made her chest tighten for reasons she didn't understand. In the cramped, noisy plane, that single moment felt strangely calm, like an unexpected breath she didn't know she needed. The toddler held the cookie box close like a treasure, her tiny fingers brushing crumbs off her dress as she peeked shyly at the man who had helped her. He stood a few steps away now, waiting for the line to move, his shoulders squared with a confidence that made him seem out of place among the restless passengers. Yet every so often, his gaze drifted back almost unconsciously toward the mother and her children, as though something about them refused to let him look away. The little girl lifted a single cookie, holding it with both hands the way a child holds something important. She stretched her arm toward him, her eyes sparkling with a bold innocence that made her mother's breath catch. The man blinked, briefly startled, as though no one had offered him something so simple or so sincere in a very long time. His lips curved into a faint smile he tried to hide, but the softness lingered in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," the mother whispered, her face flushing with embarrassment. She shifted her newborn higher on her shoulder, wincing as the baby fussed again. She didn't want to bother anyone. She never did. She likes sharing things. The man crouched down just enough to meet the toddler's gaze. "That's a good thing," he said gently, accepting the cookie but not eating it, almost as if it were something delicate he didn't want to break. The toddler giggled, delighted, while her mother felt a strange warmth spread through her, unexpected and confusing. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Not anymore. The baby let out a soft cry, a tiny, trembling sound that made the mother's heart squeeze. She rocked him, anxiety tightening her shoulders. The man's expression shifted, concern flickering there, unguarded for a second. Then he stood, but instead of stepping away, he lowered his voice and leaned slightly closer. "I'll come sit near you once everyone settles," he said, almost as if he was making a quiet promise. His tone carried something warm, steady, grounding, something that made the mother swallow hard against a sudden burn of emotion. Not pity, not judgment, something closer to recognition. Before she could respond, the line pushed him forward, but he turned one last time, offering her a small, reassuring nod. The mother watched him go, her toddler giggling with cookie crumbs on her cheeks, the baby settling against her chest, and for the first time since boarding, she felt something unfamiliar ripple through her exhaustion. Hope. The moment the wheels left the ground, the plane lurched hard to one side, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The mother's heart shot into her throat. Her newborn stiffened in her arms, tiny fists trembling, and her toddler's legs froze mid-swing as the overhead lights flickered. The seatbelt sign glowed a warning red above them. The captain's voice crackling through the speakers, strained but professional. Turbulence, just turbulence. But the mother's breathing quickened anyway. Memories of every nightmare scenario she'd ever feared rushing to the surface. Her toddler whimpered, wide-eyed now. Cookie crumbs stuck to her cheek like little freckles. "Mama?" she whispered, reaching out blindly. The mother pulled her close, doing her best to anchor them both. But her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. The plane rattled again, sharper this time, and several passengers cursed under their breaths. 2 rows back, the man in the suit was already watching them. He had been watching since takeoff, his expression tense, jaw locked as though every instinct in him wanted to move, but discipline kept him glued to his seat. Another jolt hit, harder, and the baby let out a tiny, pained cry. That was all it took. He unbuckled without hesitation. Passengers gasped. A flight attendant started toward him with a raised hand. But he didn't care. He braced himself against the overhead compartment, steady and sure even as the plane bounced under him, and moved down the aisle with urgent, determined steps. Every movement felt intentional, controlled but heavy with something unspoken. He stopped right beside their row, crouched low to keep his balance, his presence suddenly filling the small space like a shield. The toddler stared at him with wet eyes, her fear dissolving the instant she saw him. "Hey," he murmured, voice soft but grounding. "I'm right here." The mother stared at him, shocked, her breath catching at the sight of a stranger breaking rules for them. No, not for them. For her children. His attention stayed steady on the little girl, offering comfort with a calmness she didn't understand. It felt practiced, familiar, painfully so. Her toddler reached for him with both hands, clinging to his jacket sleeve as the plane trembled again. Somehow, impossibly, he made the chaos feel less terrifying. The mother swallowed hard, blinking away tears she didn't want to acknowledge, her fear mixing with a strange new feeling, safety, drawn from the presence of a man whose name she didn't even know. The turbulence eased slowly like a storm, reluctantly releasing them. But he didn't move, didn't stand, didn't leave. He just stayed there beside them, steady and unshaken, as if he'd silently claimed the space next to their fear, and vowed not to let it swallow them whole. The cabin slowly quieted as the turbulence faded, but the mother's heartbeat didn't. She could still feel it hammering in her chest, the leftover fear rattling through her bones. The newborn whimpered softly, his tiny face pressed against her collarbone, and she adjusted him with trembling arms. Her toddler, still clinging to the man's sleeve, breathed in quick, shaky little puffs until she looked at him. The moment her eyes met his, she calmed. Just like that. The mother watched it happen, watched the tension melt from her daughter's small shoulders as if the man's presence wrapped around her like something warm and familiar. It should have eased the mother, too. But instead it stirred something inside her she couldn't quite name, something that felt like a long locked door cracking open. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thin, barely audible over the quiet hum of the engines. She didn't know how to express the relief flooding her chest, or the gratitude pressing up her throat. No one ever helped her. Not like this, not with such instinct, such urgency. But the man only shook his head, his breath unsteady as he gently brushed a stray cookie crumb from the toddler's cheek. "She reminds me of someone," he murmured, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His eyes flickered, soft, haunted, pulled toward someplace far away. The mother saw the change immediately, the stiffness in his jaw, the shadow behind his calm expression, the hint of grief he tried to swallow back. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself in bathroom mirrors, in grocery store aisles, in late-night silence when the world stopped pretending. She wondered what he had lost. Passengers around them settled again, flipping through magazines or shutting their eyes, completely unaware of the quiet storm unfolding. In row 14, the overhead lights dimmed just a little, leaving the man's face brushed with golden shadow. He stayed crouched beside them even though the plane had steadied. He didn't return to his seat. He didn't even glance back at it. The toddler leaned closer, wrapping her tiny arms around his forearm like it belonged to her. He froze, breath catching, his eyes blinking rapidly as if her touch broke something open inside him. "I'm sorry," the mother murmured, embarrassed again, reaching to gently pull her daughter back. But he stopped her with the smallest shake of his head. "It's okay," he said softly. "Really." And for a moment, one impossibly fragile moment, it felt, like the three of them existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the plane. A quiet, unexpected connection held together by a trembling toddler's touch, and the raw ache of a man who clearly hadn't been held onto in a very long time. Midway through the flight, the cabin lights dimmed further, leaving everything washed in a soft amber glow. Shadows stretched across the seats, and the low rumble of the engines became almost a lullaby. The mother finally began to breathe normally again, her body loosening just enough to realize how stiff and exhausted she truly was. Her newborn shifted against her chest, emitting tiny whimpers that weren't quite cries, more like fragile reminders that he needed her every second. The man watched the baby stir, his eyes softening with an ache he tried hard to hide. He reached out instinctively, fingers pausing in midair. Before he touched anything, as if muscle, memory had moved before permission. The mother saw it. The hesitation, the longing, the pain. I used to do this, he whispered, voice barely holding together. He gently settled his hand on the armrest instead, anchoring himself. Before her mother took her, the words slipped out raw, unguarded, and the mother felt them hit her. Like a sudden drop of the plane. She turned to him slowly, seeing the crack in his carefully controlled composure. His gaze wasn't on her now. It was on the baby, the toddler, the quiet intimacy of a family he no longer had, a phantom life he carried like a wound. The toddler, still curled against his arm, looked up at him with serious little eyes. Sensing something her young mind couldn't put into words, she reached up and touched his cheek with her tiny hand, soft and trusting. He froze, breath trembling. His throat worked as he swallowed the emotion rising too fast, too hard. The mother's own heart clenched. Not with pity. She could never pity someone who held himself together with this much quiet strength, but with recognition. She knew what it was to lose pieces of your life you never got back, to fight grief alone, to break in silence. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, though she knew the answer before he even breathed it. He let out a small laugh, one that cracked at the edges. "I should be asking you that." But his voice held a tremor he couldn't hide, a plea tucked beneath the words, one that begged her not to look too closely and, at the same time, silently wished she would. Around them, passengers were settling into naps or headphones, oblivious to the fragile emotional current humming in the narrow row. The plane wasn't shaking anymore. But the man was, very slightly, very quietly, and the mother felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't expected to feel for a stranger. Not attraction, not sympathy. Connection, a deep, fragile thread tying her pain to his, stitching two lonely worlds together in the dim light above the clouds. The toddler snuggled against him again as if giving him permission to breathe. He closed his eyes for a moment, just one heartbeat of surrender, letting the warmth of her small presence steady him. And when he opened them again, the mother saw a man fighting to hold himself together, while the universe, in the tiny shape of a child's hand, offered him one moment of peace. The engines hummed steadily as the plane drifted deeper into the night sky, the world outside the windows nothing but blackness and scattered stars. The mother shifted slightly, feeling the weight of her newborn grow heavier with sleep, his tiny breaths warming the hollow beneath her collarbone. Her own exhaustion pressed into her like a quiet ache. But she stayed alert, habit, survival, motherhood all wrapped into one. Beside her, the man remained seated in the empty spot he had taken without hesitation, not invading, not imposing, just present in a way that felt strangely necessary. The toddler lay half asleep against him, her small body rising and falling in slow, gentle rhythms. His large hand rested carefully near her back, not fully touching her but close enough to protect, as though the slightest movement on the plane might send her tumbling, and he was ready to catch her before gravity even thought about it. The mother watched him from the corner of her eye, noticing things she hadn't before, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders never truly relaxed, the quiet flicker of something lonely behind his composed expression. He wasn't just being kind. He wasn't just being polite. He was holding himself together with threads. A soft flicker of turbulence rocked the cabin again, barely noticeable. But it was enough to make the toddler stir, her fingers tightening around his shirt. The man reacted instantly, lowering his head, murmuring something, quiet and soothing that the mother couldn't hear, but whatever it was, it worked. The toddler's tiny body went still again, comforted by a voice she'd known for less than an hour. The mother swallowed hard. She really trusts you," she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers, For a moment, everything between them stilled. The noise of the cabin, the hum of the engines, the low mutters of restless passengers. His gaze held something warm and unguarded, something that made her chest tighten in a way she wasn't prepared for. She shouldn't, he said softly. Kids shouldn't trust strangers so easily. His voice was gentle, but underneath it lived a sadness so deep it sounded nearly irreversible. But she reminds me of my daughter. Same eyes, same bravery. There it was again, the wound he tried to hide, but couldn't. The mother could feel its gravity pulling the truth out of him piece by piece. Where is she now? She asked, but carefully, gently, like stepping toward a sleeping animal. You don't want to startle. In another state, he said, looking down at his hands. Her mother moved. Without warning, without giving me a choice. His voice caught on the last word. I haven't seen her in months. The mother's heart cracked for him before she could stop it. She knew abandonment, but the unique agony of being kept from your own child, that was another kind of suffering entirely. His breath trembled just once. Then he composed himself again, but she had already heard the break in it. The toddler shifted again and sleepily placed her tiny hand over his heart, as if sealing the truth he had just spoken. His eyes squeezed shut, and for a moment he looked like a man trying not to fall apart at 30,000 feet. The mother felt her own defenses soften, something inside her reaching out toward him without permission. There was no romance here, no spark of desire, just two people tangled in their own bruises, finding solace in the presence of another soul who understood loss without explanation. He opened his eyes slowly, meeting hers with a raw honesty he didn't seem capable of offering anyone else. And in that quiet space, somewhere above the clouds, she realized they weren't strangers anymore, not in the way that mattered. The captain's voice murmured through the cabin, announcing their descent, and the mother felt the shift of the plane as it dipped through clouds toward the sleeping city below. Lights flickered through the windows like scattered constellations, reflections dancing across the man's face as he watched the world come back into view. The toddler stirred, blinking drowsily, her cheek still pressed against his arm as though she belonged there. He should have eased away. He should have returned to his own seat. But he didn't move, not even when the flight attendants passed by, checking belts and seats and tray tables. He stayed right beside them, anchored in a place he wasn't supposed to be, his presence radiating quiet protectiveness that felt impossible to ignore. The mother felt the descent tighten her stomach, but not from fear this time. Something else churned inside her, something warm and fragile, something she didn't dare name. She looked at him, at the way he held himself with a mixture of strength and vulnerability, and she realized she didn't want him to go back to his seat either. The toddler lifted her head slowly, rubbing her eyes. She looked at the man with sleepy trust, as though waking from a dream she didn't want to leave. Then in a small, trembling voice, she asked the question that made his breath catch. If I share my cookie, will you stay? The world seemed to still around them. Even the engines softened, their roar slipping into the background as the meaning behind her tiny words settled between them. The mother's breath hitched. She felt the punch of emotion so sharp she had to blink it away quickly, afraid it might break her open. The man stared at the toddler, stunned, his expression flickering through surprise, tenderness and pain all at once. Her innocent gaze held none of the conditions or complications adults carried, just a simple plea for presence, for comfort, for someone who made the sky feel less scary. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening. When he looked up at the mother, she saw it, the silent war inside him, the ache of wanting to stay and the fear that he didn't deserve to. His eyes looked glassy in the dim light, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The toddler nudged the cookie box toward him, her tiny hand shaking with hope. He exhaled shakily, then placed his hand over hers, gentle, steady, as though accepting something sacred. His voice came out raw, barely more than a whisper, trembling under the weight of everything he'd been holding in. Yes, he said. I'll stay. The mother felt the world tilt, not from the landing gear lowering, but from the truth woven into those 4 words. A promise, a choice, a step toward something neither of them had expected when they boarded the plane. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the cabin filling with the sounds of arrival, seat belts clicking, phones buzzing, passengers stretching. But in row 14, none of them moved. The toddler curled back against him with a satisfied sigh. the mother watching with eyes full of questions and hope she didn't dare speak. For the first time in a long time, none of them felt alone. And though the plane had landed, something else between them was just beginning to lift its wings.